So I'm going to talk to you today about southern African cables, and it's a little bit difficult to, I suppose, not go above a certain geographical point when we're having that discussion, and Ryan will have to bear with me if I cross over the border for his presentation on East. But one of the critical things from our perspective is that if we just see SEACOM as purely a cable system, then that's a little bit of a problem for me. As my team has heard from me many times, as a cable system owner, if I stand on the beach and look out towards my cable system buried somewhere between 5,000 and 5,000 metres below the waterline, I can see some fishermen bobbing around. I can see a few palm trees on islands off in the distance, but there's not too many customers out there. All of my customers are behind me, and realistically, that's a challenge for any of us in the subsea business. Is that if we think that we are solving the problems of the world by purely building subsea systems and landing them, then we very quickly find out that there are a whole bunch of other challenges about actually getting to customers and making them work. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is very much that, the whole ecosystem that goes with subsea systems and how we deliver them. Just to give you a bit of an idea of progression from our perspective, obviously SEACOM cable landed in 2009, very quickly followed by others down the east coast. But it's, I think, one of the things that's certainly become clear to me since I arrived at SEACOM about 8 months or so ago was that SEACOM was very much a disruptor. SEACOM caused within the ecosystem both different expectations about price, about responsiveness, about availability of capacity, and enabled many of the things that we see going on. As a disruptor, to be honest, that position doesn't last for too long. So, and as the owner of a single subsea cable system, it should be apparent to most of us that's not really what anybody builds a network on the backbone of. Most customers need diversity, as well as better pricing and better availability. And as we look at our network today, then you'll see that we have reach right round Africa as we take positions in other cable systems and participate in building. Obviously, one of the great advantages of SEACOM has been that not only do we have the reach into Europe, but also the reach across to Southern Asia through Mumbai. And increasingly we're finding with the growth of the Asian market and the interest in Africa from the Asian market that is becoming a very important route for us, just as important as Europe is, obviously because of the predominance of content being reached through Europe. But as we look forward, then we also see that what starts to change on this is not so much about subsea, but a lot about what happens terrestrially in Africa. And Africa presents, and increasingly in Southern Africa, presents many challenges in terms of reaching. Southern Africa we find now is fairly well served. If you consider what's happening in regard to cable systems, we have available many on the east coast. We have older cable systems such as SAT3 as well. We have WAX just landed. We have ACE coming down the west coast in the future. And of course, many discussions about other cable systems, including a number from Brazil or Southern America coming towards Africa. As my general experience in the subsea world shows, is that as soon as about 4 or 5 people are talking about the same route, then it's most likely that one of those cable systems will get built. It would seem that a South America to Africa cable system is fairly certain, because I think I now can count 5 or 6 that are being spoken about. So we will see much more capacity coming, and what the availability of those cable systems does for us is obviously to increase diversity, to reduce latency, to give us much more competitive pressure as well. And as much as I'd love to think that that competitive pressure didn't have to have an impact on prices, I'm afraid our experience both in Africa and elsewhere shows that that will continue to happen. The internet ecosystem, and this is why just talking about subsea doesn't really get us there. For all the changes that we've seen in the subsea world and the international reach that we've delivered, effectively what we've done is move the bottleneck a lot more inland and terrestrially. And that bottleneck is represented not only by the pricing, but by the availability of routes, by the availability of capacity, and all of the other elements that need to come into that ecosystem. And the ecosystem consists certainly of capacity, of international and domestic reach. But it also consists and requires domestic infrastructure, the ability to have data centres which we can reliably interconnect, the ability to have metro networks that get to customers' houses and importantly from a business perspective to various offices, that provides diversity itself within that last mile. Because we also know that the most risky part of any network tends to be that last mile. And the one thing that manages to outpace customers' expectations about price, it seems to me, is customers' expectations about quality. And as soon as we started to break through some of the capacity bottlenecks that we'd seen previously in Africa, we've certainly moved very quickly to issues of quality. How do we actually get reliability? How do customers get that certainty of having their networks available 24/7, not only in terms of just purely switched on, but in terms of the throughput that they can achieve? There's also upstream connectivity. At the moment, Africa is extremely dependent from an internet perspective on content that is based offshore. We expect that that will change, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that upstream connectivity reaching to various content, whether that be for domestic use or for business use, is absolutely critical. And getting to it from a low latency perspective, which is a relative judgment at the moment in regard to Africa because of the distances we're travelling, is also critical, because there are just certain applications that are not going to work. So if you look at some of the markets that I've worked in before, such as the Trans-Pacific, the Transatlantic, and across Asia as well, one of the growth industries that we've seen has been high-frequency trading, the ability to do algorithmic trading on stock exchanges where you are effectively dealing in very, very small amounts of movement and arbitraging those, but doing that constantly on a multiple activity per second. That requires extremely short latency. And what you see is that a customer was quite happy to pay as much as a 50% premium to save things like less than 1 millisecond. Now, obviously, given the distances and the latencies we're dealing with in Africa, and especially from southern Africa at the moment, we're talking at higher levels of latency variance. But at the moment, any high-frequency trading that is done by Southern African banks and institutions tends to be done by being located in London. But already we see that with the arrival of some of the new cable systems, with some of the resilience that we're getting in the networks, then we can see more of that moving to Southern Africa. We expect to see more of that happening in exchanges such as the JSE and others around Africa. And that will also start to drive a lot of changes in terms of what's expected. The other components of the ecosystem are content. The ability to actually access content is obviously fairly critical. That's why we have connectivity. We're getting to something. As I said, we see that content at the moment mainly housed offshore. It is critical that we bring as much of that content as we can towards Africa, and that we also provide platforms to distribute African content. The ability to develop African content is going to be determined a little bit by what subsea systems can do and international connectivity can do. But in terms of taking what you see if you go to a place like Nairobi or any of the other iHubs that are scattered around Africa, and you find young people, designers, developers, sitting and working on their new applications, which are usually fairly specific to African needs. Their ability to develop those always amazes me, and they do them usually on laptops that are 5 years old, nowhere near what those that most of us use at our work every day. They don't have server environments. They're doing them on individual laptops. Once they get them developed, though, their ability to put those into an environment in which they can distribute them, can monetize them, can get them to customers, is very limited. And we think that creating that content environment, the ability to distribute it, basically through both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, is going to be critical to the growth of African internet business and African content. Once we start to have that capability, then we will see much more content being developed here, and we'll also see a lot more growth. Ubiquity is the last thing I'll mention under the ecosystem. The ubiquity issue is simply the ability to do anything from anywhere. And as to whether we will ever achieve that, I suppose I'll leave to others to discuss. But certainly that should be our objective. We want to be able to reach any content. We want to be able to do things that at the moment we cannot do, that are latency dependent. We want to be able to effectively remove the barriers to doing that, and the building of the ecosystem is going to be critical to achieving that. In the same way that the railways opened up the 19th century for industry, for the movement of people, for the beginning of what we see nowadays as a very strong globalisation, then broadband telecommunications infrastructure, the internet, is going to be critical in the same way. There is at the moment a disconnect in the economics of communication. So we have seen dramatic improvements in the pricing of international connectivity, and we'll continue to see those. However, we're not seeing the same changes as yet in the domestic infrastructure, the backhaul or long-haul networks domestically, and we're certainly not seeing them as yet in the last mile connectivity, whether that be done on a fibre basis, a copper basis, or in fact satellite and mobile broadband. So we see quite a disconnect between the pricing as opposed to the distance. This is a little bit like, I suppose a comparison would be to fly halfway up the coast of Mozambique from Maputo and pay the same price or a little bit more than you would to fly from Maputo to London. And we're certainly seeing some of those economic disruptors at the moment. We expect that they will change in the same way that the arrival of new cable systems has changed the pricing on international. Then we expect that we will continue to see changes here, both through competitive pressure, not only from African users, but also from international and their expectations, and also, more importantly, the arrival of new players. If we look at where competition is happening, in the subsea world, it's very high. Whether we be on the East Coast and think about who we compete with, or now increasingly, especially in Southern Africa, we have to see the competition as really being between both coasts, then all of us are dealing in a very, very competitive environment. Within South Africa, if we look at the competitiveness in the long-haul networks, say, for example, getting from Cape Town to Johannesburg, that's changing, but it's still not at the same level until we see some of the new fibre coming online from some of the new builders, and that is expected to occur during 2013, then we probably won't see some of that. And in the short-haul networks that Telkom largely control, probably low levels at the moment. But already we are seeing, I think, with the arrival of WACS in the last couple of weeks and some of the other pressures, we're starting to see some movement there. And I expect that we will see probably more improvements in what a consumer, whether they be business or residential, would think of as their cost of access. We're going to see more improvement in those latter two elements than we're probably going to see in international as a contributor. Let's look a little bit of the journey of a byte, whether it be from your office or your home. The last mile and backhaul is probably the key issue, especially when we're talking about ubiquitous access, and especially when we're talking about expanding in Africa and making this available to as many customers as possible. For many people, obviously, fibre to the home is not going to happen in the near term, if we look at the vast majority of the network. However, what we are seeing in Africa is that the availability of mobile broadband far outstrips the penetration in other markets, and that includes well-developed markets. Now, and there we're talking about 2 to 3G, when we're talking about 3 to 4G in mobile, as it comes online progressively throughout Africa and Southern Africa, especially over the next couple of years, we expect to see much more of our broadband access occurring at that point. And what we're also expecting to see is not only that penetration rate increasing, but also effectively the size of the bandwidth increasing dramatically. And these are two of the things that get me very excited in Africa. We obviously look at Africa, we see low penetration, but we also see the penetration we've got, it's not exactly running at 10 meg or anything like that on a regular basis. So we're going to see the uplift not only from the penetration growing, from the broadband access levels growing, but also in many parts of Africa, also from the massive population growth that is expected to occur. If we keep going up the line and we get to the critical players in this infrastructure from a user's perspective, honestly, the ISPs, whether they be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the small guys who are trying to do small things out there, or the much bigger players in our markets, and the services that they deliver, and how they manage their networks, and how they connect, and how they get diversity into those networks, and also the cloud services that they're offering. And we think, and I'll talk about this a bit later, the cloud services are going to be a critical component of success of the internet in Africa. Then we really get to the bits that, to some extent, are simpler. They are about physical infrastructure, about getting fibre in the ground or fibre in the sea and getting that working. And then connecting to well-established markets, in many cases, where internet capacity is obviously readily available. So if you look at where we take capacity to at the moment, obviously when we get to Europe, the choice of who we break that out to and hand it off to in terms of tier 1 and tier 2 IP players is massive. And reaching the rest of the world at that point is great. And obviously as we head over also to Southern Asia and Southeastern Asia, we have exactly the same options, whether we're in India, Singapore, Hong Kong, or elsewhere in Asia. So much of that infrastructure, once we reach it, exists. Long haul and submarine capacity is about construction. Submarine, as I've said, I think is well under control and happening at the moment. There are some, obviously some challenges in ensuring how we work together to ensure both diversity and restoration, because my long time in Asia tells me that there is one thing is certain, and that is that linear cable systems do have problems from time to time. And we've already seen the impact of some of those. And I think you'll find that as many of us work more closely together and people build more resilient networks, then some of those risks will disappear from the user experience. But then the long-haul networks, the building of the fibre within countries and between countries, especially across the borders that allow us to get to, whether it be Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, in Southern Africa, and get connectivity then back to those key submarine systems, is still probably lagging about 2 or 3 years behind what we've seen in submarine. And as I've said, I think that probably the latter part of 2013 will be a bit of a watershed as we see a number of new systems coming online there, from the DFAs, from the fibre codes, the completion of the NLD builds and others. So the full value chain then looks quite complex, and focusing purely on subsea as the place to get all the improvements is probably unreasonable. We've got a lot of work to do in these other parts, and if we as subsea players were simply to sit back and say and start pointing at people, then that wouldn't be the way to do it. We have to play a role in making clear what our requirements are, in what our expectations are in terms of price points, in assisting with funding where we can do it, in motivating governments to get things done. Some of the ways that we do that are to basically absorb cost where we can. Telling a customer that merely I'm sitting at my cable station and coming to me is the only way you can solve it is not going to work. We have to work out how we get inland to meet those customers, and we do a lot of that already. One of the challenges is, if I say that it's not enough for us to sit back in our cable stations and be happy with life, we need to change some things, is what can we do? We certainly work strongly with governments and regulators in terms of looking at licensing and helping them understand what sort of licensing structures would work. We push as much as we can for local loop unbundling, and I think we increasingly have to do that in conjunction with other players so that we can see those last mile networks used in the most efficient manner possible. Public-private partnerships are another method of doing this. Investment is not building these networks up front is not cheap, obviously, in the same way that building submarine networks is not. And especially when there are some of the long-haul challenges that we have in southern Africa, getting across borders and making our way through rock in various places, then we also need to participate in some of these. We also need to try and motivate governments around Africa to assist in making it easier and also look for incentives. A number of governments, and many of you be aware, are already well aware of the importance of the ICT infrastructure for the success and the growth of their economies. That alone, being aware of it, is not enough. So what we have to do is motivate it, whether it be at the ministerial or the PS or the presidential level, to see people making changes, to see resources that already exist within government control being made more easily available, to meet up with the private investments that have occurred, and to make those available to people and accessible at price points that make sense. And then the other thing that probably has the biggest impact is that, and I've said it a number of times already, competition. Market forces have changed dramatically the whole internet space over the last few years in Africa and Southern Africa especially. Not only because of the arrival of SEACOM, but because of the arrival of others. And because as those systems have come online, people from outside of Africa looking into Africa have certain expectations. So last week, a number of us in this room also were present in Chicago for the ITW conference, one of two major global carrier conferences held every year, just over 5,000 delegates there. And most of our discussions were with, not so much African entities, though there were a number of those, but with entities outside of Africa, carriers looking to get in, bringing their customers or helping their customers from a BN perspective get connectivity. And they are also looking for ways to motivate governments to make changes. I mentioned cloud briefly before. Basically, I suppose we're in that move from the subsea world being the blue ocean to the clouds. And the SEACOM model to date has largely been about the ocean. As the cloud gets built though, and exploited, it offers to Africa an enormous opportunity, because infrastructure doesn't exist in the same way that it does in other more developed markets. Here we have a reasonably clean sheet to start with, and the ability to take a lot of the cloud infrastructure and introduce it into Africa, it requires not so much that we are replacing other infrastructure, but we are in fact putting new infrastructure in place. It's very clear to us that cloud is coming to Africa, and it does require special treatment. It requires resilient infrastructure, platforms, content, and possibly most importantly, it requires open access. Cloud is not an environment that you can try and lock up and keep it all for yourself. It requires to be built on OpenStack and open source. It requires that we make it available, especially in Africa, to as many people as we possibly can. And we look forward to participating actually quite a bit in this space. We have some initiatives underway already, and we'll be announcing more about those later this year as we complete some trials. But we think that cloud is going to offer an enormous amount of access, of infrastructure, and of capability to Africans who have just not had access to that previously. Takeaways. I'm just going to put all of these up. So whilst it's true that submarine has been fairly critical to the changes that we've seen over the last few years in the internet in Africa and Southern Africa, there are many players to that. The ecosystem, the ecosystem requires for the end consumers that we break down some of those challenges, that we get the bandwidth actually to the home and the office, that we get peering and local transit working properly, we have neutral internet exchanges, and we enable connectivity as close to the consumer as we possibly can, rather than insisting on tromboning everything back up to Europe and back. and we need to break through the last mile connectivity barriers. From our perspective, we think the good news is that market forces are continuing to drive those changes in the other elements of the ecosystem. But cooperation, pressure, and activity is going to be required to make sure that it works for all of the people of Africa. We need to make sure that we don't just rest on our laurels at SEACOM, that as a disruptor from 2009 that we keep staying ahead of the market and help to keep driving it, and that we have the ability to scale rapidly. And to that extent, we continue to invest quite strongly in our own network, upgrading it regularly. We'll put about another 150 gig into the network over the coming few months and make sure that that's available. And then the last point I'll leave you with is that we think that from our perspective and from a consumer's perspective, whether they be business or residential, the introduction of cloud over the next couple of years into Africa is going to be one of the key changes. Thank you.